Okay. Right. Okay. David, it's very good to meet you. I'm obsessed with people's creative journeys, how they get to where they've got to. Most of the time, people start with one aim, and then it may be fragments. But you always seem to have been polymathic in the way you've approached things. What did you want to be when you were a kid?
Um, I think there was never a point in the trajectory for me into graphic design until well into the point where I was doing graphic design, where there was a part of me that said I want to be a graphic designer. I came to accept at one point that I was doing graphic design, that I was a graphic designer. But I think growing up as a kid, I loved art, loved artists, dreamed of maybe being an artist one day. I think reached a point in my life in my late teens, early 20s where I accepted that I was not an artist, that whatever, you know, and I gave it a crack and I felt like I failed. I was paralyzed by an inability to actually manifest bodies of work. I would have ideas and then I couldn't bring them to fruition. And meanwhile, while I was having this horrible experience of trying to make art, in the background I was doing design work for people I admired, adjacent to content that I loved, music or working with artists, that was so much more easy to resolve and was also took this burden of something that I think was something that I'm happy I overcame in my life, to be honest, in that I think maybe the thing that was standing between me and manifesting the work was that I didn't really have a good reason to make it other than to satisfy my own ego. Like, I just had what I thought were great ideas and thought that they should exist. And design and doing design for other people, I was thinking about the audience and why they should, if someone's made a great album and I wanted people to spend time with the album, and I knew how much they might love the music, and it was important that someone handled it with care or translated that work. And I think that it's funny that it took me so long to realize what I was even doing, or why I was struggling with the other work. But yeah, my ego needed a good kick in the pants, so to speak, and I was much more comfortable thinking about the viewer.
It sounds like you needed purpose. Nothing wrong with that. But it's interesting that design still, in some senses, has a lower status than art because it has purpose, because it has function. And art somehow, with no function whatsoever, of course it has a major function in expression and contemplation and meditation and so on, but art is somehow more revered. But you are an artist in a sense, but maybe it's the art world which speaks the language of pluralism that is more hung up about status, or the status of art and being an artist, because you are an artist.
I don't use that term to describe my work. I also am at least aware enough about art history to know that that doesn't matter, that I don't need to designate a work art or even have to pull the kind of Duchampian trick of elevating my work to art by placing it in context where it will be seen as art-like. The work that I love, the things that I came to love through history and felt were the most miraculous works, were works that achieved their status as having meaning almost in spite of their context, that came out of things which were seen as not very dignified or intrinsically valuable.
For instance,
I think the artists, and I'll call them artists, that I really admire from the Northern Renaissance, people like Albrecht Dürer, who was clearly manifestly a phenomenally talented visual artist and could work in disciplines that would bestow him a great deal of status. He could paint, he could draw very well, he could work with wealthy clients. But I think a big inspiration in the design practice that I currently have and the work that I try and do is that it's still not acknowledged by most people who know Dürer's work, and it's not interesting to most art critics, that he was an unbelievable technical innovator in print, that he mechanically refined woodblock printing in his practice and in his workshop to a status that invented a new category of art, invented a new possibility for pictures that could have meaning, and that genre, that mechanism, that platform that he created was far more democratic, permeated in a far broader way into society than any one painting he could have done or any drawing. I think that he still doesn't even get the credit for doing that, and that's fine. The interesting thing is, I think the social consequences, the historical consequences of that, and if I look outside of it to some of the things which I love as well, in music and designers who are now starting to get the recognition. Every graphic designer of my generation will talk about the influence of somebody like Peter Saville on their practice, but when Peter Savile's designing Unknown Pleasures, Joy Division haven't released an album. No one's heard of this band, or at least a few people in Manchester have. Like, he elevates them to that. He creates that. He also creates a generation who spend time with the work. He elevates their idea of what design can be. He expands their world. That's an art-like experience, but it doesn't attempt to be seen in an art gallery in order to transmit its affect or its power or its meaning. And I just think, for me, the idea of being able to utilize processes, utilize one of the great positives and evils of our age, the mass globalized distribution of like junk layer culture, which permeates every aspect of our globe, and in many ways is, both creates a lot of its adornment, decoration, and joy, and is also choking it and kind of suffocating it under a layer of detritus. If you can put things into that layer that feel like they have meaning, that feel like they actually become sites where people return to them, they form memory, they form language, that they share them with other people, that they have a genesis, that they have descendants. That was the kind of work that I felt like I had a purpose when I was doing. And yeah, I think I like that identification, that in doing that I felt like I found my purpose. What's become more interesting to me over time as well is to try and really identify what the full gamut of things in that space could be. I did a lot of work in music, but starting to look outside of it, with publishing now with the studio, our first book, but also pushing into digital publishing, works in other media, trying to see if there are ways to retain the spirit of that gesture in different formats.
There's so much to unpack there, but your observation, which obviously is acknowledged by art historians, but you're right, in the broad response, say, to Dürer or to other Northern Renaissance artists, the technology is less interesting. I mean, the spurious debate around Vermeer is if somehow it's diminishing Vermeer's reputation to make the claim that he was clearly using lenses to look at the world because there's no documentary evidence that he uses lenses, as if we have any documentary evidence. It shows the sort of defensive nature of a lot of art history, that somehow that demystifies. It doesn't at all. Artists have always been able to use the available technology, and of course the Northern Renaissance, the shift from wood panelling to canvas, the shift from brush technology, pigment, and so on. This is fundamental to means of expression. And the almost cliched observation now that the Impressionists were out there painting en plein air because they had portable tubes of paint. So artists and the mobilisation of technology is endemic but often denied. What fascinates me about you and your generation and your practice in particular is you have such a multiplicity of different technologies available to you, but you seem to be able to be both engaged with and have a facility to work with so many of them. Is that pluralism? Is there a capacity for you to be able to almost engage with every level of technological production? Is that quite daunting? I mean, is it liberating to the extent that, in a sense, you don't know where to go next, or do you have natural constraints in that?
I think unquestionably for a lot of people entering into design practice, art practice now, it is daunting. It's overwhelming, and I think it's an accident of my life. I'm very lucky that I'm kind of a self-taught designer, but that I came into it through the path that I did through art history, where I had to build my own rationale for what I was doing, so that when I did approach technology, when I did approach the practices of the design industry, firstly, I was approaching it from a position where I was highly skeptical and in many ways quite had an innate repulsion to some of the ways that design practices operated. I had a few designers I admired, but I really couldn't understand my role as a designer with the idea of working inside a massive studio that was doing these, huge global campaigns that felt like they were indifferent to the human level at which they operated. And so I was trying to find a path where things made sense to me. And I think that the way I make sense of technology is a kind of post hoc thing where it's not the core of my practice. I'm never fetishizing a particular method or application. I'm not saying like, oh, for my next project, I'm going to do it in VR. Everything starts at a core. And I think for me, I understand that the core of my work is language, that the technology I'm most interested in is language, its components, and its use as a data storage medium, as a social gestalt for creating meaning. How works are described, articulated, received by their viewer as language, both overt in how we speak about a work or record it, but also the incredible, mystical, sublime terrain of the invisible language, of memory, of whatever filing system we make sense of when we see things. The space in which I think I try and make the work operate is that terrain. The tools I use to do it are sensational, are experiential, are material. I'm very pragmatic about how I arrive at those results. I think if I'm thinking about the language that I want to create, and it's why also at the core of my practice, I think the core of my practice was built around type and type design, because that was the closest I came to understanding the synthesis between language as a storage medium and language as an aesthetic medium. And that by creating the type, I was able to craft the voice of the data and create a cultural context for it, create a space in which it may unveil itself to the viewer as unusual or surreptitiously enter without them noticing, that there were qualities of language which could also be activated by type, and that by starting to draw type and starting to think about the role that type played in every visual system, but also in every encounter for the viewer, that was really how I built my core vocabulary of working. And technology is something which, in my opinion, the problem of having such an extraordinary array of tools to work with is that we squander them, that we don't refine them, that we don't need to take any of them to the delightful, inspiring peak of their potential, because they're replaced and upgraded and refined before we get the chance to master them. I think I'm happy to work on a 2012 MacBook Pro and still work in Photoshop CS3 and to try and do work that still surprises or delights or confounds a viewer, that doesn't feel like it's nostalgic or fetishistic of those origins, but that I'm trying to push that tool. I'm interested in when the tool is pushed to its operational limits. I feel I do better work when I think to reach that last 10% of utility from a tool, that's when you have to understand it. That's when you have to really, I don't like to use the word master, but it's why I think there's a lot of wisdom in a lot of craft-based practices that are brutally repetitive and that refuse to update their core tools. I think that it's very interesting to me the difference between, for example, Eastern cooking techniques and Western cooking techniques, and when you would see some of the forms of experimentation that can take place within rigorously traditional disciplines like sushi, for example, where your space for experimentation may be that after 10 years you chose to store the soy sauce in a wooden container, not a ceramic one, and that completely changes your feeling of how the food tastes. I'm happy to see that I think people are realizing that that it is not intelligent, it's not a good use of the human experience to not appreciate the fundamentals of a system. Superficial change, development, just doubling the RAM in your computer or something doesn't make you twice as smart, and it doesn't make the tool twice as useful. I do think that there's a difference in attitude that maybe is starting to emerge in a new generation who are more interested in the idea of doing more with less, of being more sustainable, of appreciating and respecting the tools that you have, not throwing them away every year and upgrading them, but maybe trying to work longer with them. That I hope also speaks to an approach which isn't just an act of sacrifice, but that I think you can potentially also come to learn more about the fundamentals of the thing as well.
But is process a means to an end, or is the exploration of process still intrinsically part of the work? I mean, I take your point about not fetishizing process. It's a language you want to realise and explore. But how important is the journey of process for you?
It's dualistic. It's so important to me. It's discipline. It's like a martial artist who gets up and just for 2 hours every day, practices their stances. It's irrelevant to the viewer. I would be fetishizing it if I believed it was important or it made the work better that I did it in this way. I don't know how the cave paintings at Lascaux were made. I don't know how the Venus of Willendorf was made.
Some of them were spat. Some of them were got it.
I don't think it should matter. I do think that there's an almost, even from a social political perspective, the apparatus of control required to educate every viewer to appreciate the context of something in order to understand its value is an enormous, restrictive, even violent thing that's welded. It's like a class prejudice, really, that like, oh, you don't understand how good those paintings are because you're just not educated enough to understand why those are the best paintings, and these ones which you walked in and you liked more are not as good as those ones because there's this hidden layer of social history behind them that you don't have access to. I love working in the vernacular because accidentally it has the opposite means of affect. It has to work with immediate response. I love working with popular culture, not because I prioritize low over high, but because strategies exist within popular culture of reaching viewers who are not expected, and indeed it would be an obstacle for them to have to like see a sophisticated layer as the reason they like something.
But knowledge and experience does count for something, and that somebody who comes to a football match gets more out of it by understanding the rules, the nuances, than someone who just comes to it as if it's the first time. And so it is with art, and so it is with all areas. It doesn't make your experience necessarily better than someone else's immediate response to something, but knowing something about something and actually having the interest to put time into something to understand it better, I think it's admirable. I don't think that's elitist. And I'm sort of bored of a culture where people's opinions on everything somehow are equally valid. So, no one shoves a microphone under people's faces in the street and go, what do you think about genome technology or chaos theory? But somehow everyone is supposed to have a valid opinion about an artwork. And I think that's spurious.
I agree. The philosophy or the rationale I have as to like how I try and make sense of this, especially when I work and I'm having to reach audiences, sometimes I'm putting, you've seen in some of my work, like highly codified references into the work, or that they will speak to very esoteric pieces of art history or political history or social history that it would be unreasonable to expect most of the audience to get.
But there are many people who are looking at your work whose understanding of digital technology and blockchain technology is infinitely more sophisticated than mine, and will see it in a different way.
More sophisticated than mine. The way I see it, and I think this has helped me as a person, like, again, this journey of also trying to understand my own practice and craft, is that I think iterative systems beget language. I think if you do anything 100,000 times, you will end up with a grammar, with a syntax, with a vocabulary. Now, we prioritize certain products of iterative systems as more useful in our society, but somebody who is, I think there's two things here. Just doing something 100,000 times, ending up with vocabulary, doesn't make the vocabulary useful. But I think the more attention that you pay, and the more pliant that you are as an individual, that you start to apply that vocabulary in other places, the more interesting that is as a form of intelligence. Someone who is a master woodcarver or a metal worker or a plumber who has a fully developed vocabulary of their craft may go to that football match and not know anything about football, but observe things which me as a lay football fan may have totally missed and be able to point out to me about the way that different parts of the system are interacting, because they're applying their metaphorical language to the situation.
I think different perspectives and people have something actually very interesting fundamentally to say, or how they view something is interesting.
The thing I will say is that I think one of the greatest, again, destructive components of the way that our age works is that we're surrounded by iterative systems, certainly on the internet and certain systems of control that are designed to withhold the understanding from the user that they are participating in an iterative system. And I think that is, on a mass level, something which destroys the capacity for knowledge, perspective, awareness, and understanding. Because unlike a craft, where you are gaining awareness and reaching structured goals, people are instead being guided into desired paths, desired actions, which deny them the ability to even know or have agency over those things. They then don't understand them as acts which have meaning. And the part of the great, I think, quandary of design in this age is that most of those paths of control have been engineered by systems that emerge from the profession of design to some extent. And that, again, part of my practice as a designer is wrestling with the, I think, legitimate fact that I am complicit to a certain degree. I try and negate that in my practice, but that in working with a set of operations which can be, I think, run counter to the things I value, run counter to the way I think people should be allowed to live their lives with a degree of agency, autonomy, and perspective that design should be able to help inform, not withhold.
I think it's a well-made point. I think design is responsible for where we are to some extent, but is also the potential way forward or way out. How we maintain our relationship or mediate our relationship with the planet and the world around us is obviously something that design will help us get through, but it's also helped us get to where we are now. Thinking of specifically of Tombs, the Tombs project, I mean, in the context of just what you've been talking about, that obsession, it is an obsession of yours with repositories of knowledge or how things are stored. I mean, that's there in the system, but it's also rather expressive. If you describe the project to someone, it would seem very repetitive and banal, but actually there is such variation and such there's a tactile, sensual quality to what's done, and there's, as I said, there's huge variation. How did the project emerge? What was the trigger for it?
I would honestly say that the system by which the discs are organized, and they're highly codified. There's 177 tombs. Each of them is a member of one of 8 houses. Each of the houses has a name and its own culture to certain extents. They have themes, they have also mechanics. You could even see them as rituals or aspects of the way in which they behave in different ways on chain as objects that are codified by their contracts. But I know in my heart I'm someone who greatly appreciates systems, but I am not an architect, I'm not an engineer, I'm not someone who is highly capable with maths, I'm not someone who is capable of creating flawless, intricate structures. I am interested in organic, intricate structures. I think the greatest inspirations for me are bodies of language that have a degree of life and pliancy and a breadth to them. I would say that the structural forebears of the Tombs project and the things which are its greatest inspiration would be both religions and poetry. I think those are highly codified, highly ritualized, extremely dense and beautiful spaces.
Or the manuscript as the repository or the expression of those.
Yes, exactly. That both of those, it's a brilliant point. Both of those are systems that find their codification in the book form.
Why 177? Why 8 houses?
It's funny, the 177 was, it was a specific numerological choice because it has no obvious numerological connotation. I felt that I needed a number that felt like it would be a unique identifier from the series. And so this is a bizarre prime, well, it's not prime, sorry, but it's a bizarre number that doesn't currently have an obvious 177, or that's
Yeah,
a
I was trying
reference.
to think, I couldn't think.
That's a reference to so and so. Oh, that's yeah. No, I wanted one that at least felt like it was unique, but also it was a very pragmatic, material, process-based choice. What was the largest number that I could make that felt like people could live with this forever? That there would always be enough possibility for meaning or exploration, that the garden felt both vast but big enough and small enough that you felt that you could truly explore it and get to know it. It had to be a number that I felt that you could know the name of every tomb. That you didn't see the series and were immediately exhausted by the fact like, well, I'll never learn all of it. Had to be inviting, and that felt like the Goldilocks range for me. And it had to be a number that I could physically draw and name. It had to be like a manageable poem. The 8 houses started to emerge quite pragmatically from what were the polarities I felt the series needed to cover. What were the spaces and terrains in which the core ideas could meaningfully manifest. One of the biggest ones was I started to think about the structure seriously last year in 2021, when it was clear that there was this unfolding dimension of work on chain that was starting to kind of enter the popular, people were becoming aware of it outside of just esoteric blockchain spaces, that artists were putting work on chain, that audiences were starting to be interested in collecting works on chain, and that I felt that this was an interesting enough emergent paradigm in terms of the ways in which it could meaningfully differ from existing media, that it was worth exploring some of the possibilities of it. And I started to really think about the idea of doing, I put my first works on in February last year, and I started to think about the idea of what a body of work would look like that would make sense. And I think one of the things which I was attracted to was this is a very nascent period. It's early days. Norms are being established, and there were certain things about the way that people talk about the culture of work on chain that I felt there were certain illusions or delusions which needed to be questioned. One, I think the two main ways in which the series was designed to do that is the first thing. This is like Banquo's ghost. This is a presence, a manifestation in this environment of the relics of a previous paradigm of data storage. Beautiful, but also obsolete, remote, unphysically realizable images, and at the same time, hopefully compelling, enchanting, and feel that they may actually have living value in terms of the language or the imagery that they add to the space. But intrinsically, I think, manifesting that memento mori, that kind of, that vanitas of the skull in the still life, putting an image of a dead chain on the chain in a way that was beautiful, felt to me an appropriate, an interesting space. And of course, the name tombs continues to allude to that quality of them, that they are storage vessels for something that has passed beyond, that is no longer part of our contemporary plane. But also that's a fundamental structural interest in the idea of moving to a digital storage medium or a digitally distributed ledger. There was also this social component which people talked about, or had started to talk about, and especially at a very macro corporate level, the idea that this was the foundation of what people would start to refer to as the metaverse, or the idea that this is essentially a competitive reality to our own, where fully privatized, every component of your imagination, of your language, would have a point on chain that could also be owned, and by very aggressive corporate actors like Meta or Yuga Labs, that they could make land grabs almost literally, like Yuga Labs are literally selling land deeds in the metaverse, conquering as much of this space as possible, this new terrain, this frontier. It's kind of like we're going back to 1492 or something, and that they could go in and populate it, simultaneously proselytizing to their audiences that this was a great expanse of freedom, diversity, and unparalleled, unrestricted cultural movement exploration, whilst attempting
selling it as if it's parcels of land.
Exactly, totally privatized. I think that there is interesting possibilities for the social, political, artistic realms that might emerge based on work on chain. But to do that, I think that we have to make anti-monopolistic gestures. We have to literally be more interested in the idea of a multifarious world than a monopolist world.
And still sell, or we still invite people to own a particular part of it. I mean, that was not a critique, it's just an observation that the problem, that there's a sense of collective ownership, but of course people love the idea that they own a particular part of it.
This is, I think, again, it comes back to what I said. I think structurally I'm really interested in religion and poetry as structural devices almost more than any other form. The collector can be seen as an economic device in order to enrich the artist. But for me, I see it as a linguistic vessel that will carry and preserve the work beyond the bounds of my sphere of influence, beyond my lifetime, beyond anything that I can talk to or actively engage with. And I don't even want to actively engage with it. I think the beautiful thing about work is that it almost falls out from me into the world, and that I cannot control. I can only try and curate that in a conscientious manner, but that afterwards its life after me is dependent on other people, dependent on other people finding it interesting, relevant, keeping it in their lives. The act of creating a potential object that can be owned is, for me, the idea of using the conventions of our time to create something that can be carried forward, protected, placed into storage spaces and also viewing spaces, museums or personal spaces where you elevate objects. For something to last, for its language to continue to have affect, it must continue to be seen, it must continue to be thought of. And this is the arbitrage I'm happy to engage with, to create objects that could be identified as art, whether mistakenly or factually, so that they continue to have viewers. And the best way that I'm comfortable doing that is making something that I feel might genuinely feel like it does have meaning or value to its audience.
But it does open up. I mean, collection, I like your description, collectors as kind of vessels in the sense to contain. But it does open up the note. I mean, people talk about the democratization of the art world, and it's often just kind of off pat. But collecting and collectors, there is a kind of aspirational and elite quality to a lot of the way collecting is done. This really does open it up, but quite how much of a paradigmatic shift it is worth discussing a little, because you mentioned the Flemish Renaissance or Northern Renaissance, how important that was for you. That was clearly a major moment, but actually a moment over 130 years or so. This feels very immediate, but how much more radical is it than mass production of prints? How much more radical is it than the ownership of any number of different commodities that in an industrial and a post-industrial age can be produced? And how much does it fracture the conventional idea of what the art market is and what the gallery system fundamentally is?
I don't think I'm under any illusions that the medium in its current state is far from radical. It's disruptive to some existing paradigms of market distribution, but it hugely endows and enriches those that have the capital capacity to play at a higher level within it. These objects are extremely expensive. They are not, and indeed the system, if they are successful, only means that they become more expensive, more remote, more removed from the idea that somebody could own one. What I think is very interesting about the paradigm of works on chain, that really actually people talk about, they laugh at it, like I can right-click, save that image, is, well, actually, no, this is genuinely the democratizing aspect of it, whereby the fact that it's owned by someone and increasing in value makes the image itself no more remote than it was previously. It is the same, they own the same PNG, the same file that you can see for free on your screen, and indeed, by you wanting to see it for free on your screen, it's very possible that you're actually conferring further value on the original. Social value, language value, but within this system recuperated as actual capital value. I think that the things I'm most interested in about the idea of work on chain, or the work that's ledger-based or contract-based, is about creating new systems for distributing equity, for redistributing value. I think that those are the most transformative aspects. I think it's absolutely the case that the way that it's currently implemented as in general with NFT art is not in any way politically radical or socially transformative in almost its entirety. There are a few fringe areas that I think totally deserve merit and mention that are doing remarkable things. I think the platform Zora, which is a zero commission platform marketplace that has a kind of semi-curatorial aspect, but also is publicly open and available, that you can, if they can succeed in what they're doing, where they can conventionalize the idea that there is no third party taking a transaction fee on any of these works, if their model can succeed, then that will, I think, that is a definite change in the marketplace, which will have not just financial repercussions, but structural repercussions. And there are a few others, a platform called Mirror, which was one of the first which was publishing writing on chain, that was part of the inspiration for why I felt the time had come for me to publish the body of work I did last year, Exodus 2, which is it's a poem on chain divided into 19 stanzas. And as an example of some of the ways in which I think the contract is interesting from a non-financial perspective, or from something that will be not in its primary motivation a financial one, the stanzas of that poem are locked by the contract, time locked. So there are 19 stanzas, and the last one will only be released from the contract in 2061, 40 years from the publishing of the contract. There's nothing I can do about it. They double each time. So the first one launched, the second one launched 2 hours later, 4 hours later, 8 hours, etc. We're now, the next one will only unlock in 110 days from now. After that, it's like 2 years, because we've already been going for almost a year on this one for its weight. And I love the fact that this is a work that will continue to publish completely agnostically of whether there's an audience or whether there's an author. It may well continue to be publishing after I die. I'll be 75 in 2061 if I'm still around. That there's the potential here for bodies of work on chain we haven't even scratched the surface of, but also for artistic practices which are entirely divorced from the conventional models of me being some kind of traveling salesman who turns up at openings and presents new bodies of work. That if you do have statements that, or structures, or things which can be engaged with by an audience that can operate on timeframes or models of their own that are self-propagating, this is something the contract can do. And this isn't completely novel. A Solowit wall drawing is a contract-based work, but we have a system to automate and codify that, whereas Lewitt's estate have to like negotiate with someone and send someone down to instruct the people there. This is completely, and in a way that I think is elegant and pure, and there's something about it that does resemble the poem or does resemble the religion. It is just generated by its own body of law. And I've said this a number of times when I've tried to explain what I think is the paradigmatic transformation of work on chain, why I consider this a new medium, why I wanted to work in it. And it's very simple. That is the work. The contract is the artwork. The things that derive from the contract are the experience of the artwork.
Or the physical manifestation of an idea.
But that is, I think, art history recognizes that as a medium. We've seen contract-based work before. This is the first establishment of a set of protocols and paradigms where this is like the emergence of, where, concrete sculpture or something, whereby we actually have a device that creates a new medium. It's exciting for me as somebody who's interested in art history to see a medium emerge in my lifetime. It's interesting for me as somebody who makes work. I think it behooves me to try and engage with it conceptually, but also like there are possibilities here, I think, for anyone who is interested in art practice, social practice, to do interesting things in this medium. But if it just becomes a space for trading, financial tokens of apes, then nothing particularly interesting or novel will happen in the space. And so now is, I think, an interesting time to try and build some of those structures. And like I said, there's something really freeing for me about the way that publishing work in this space works, where once the contract is written and published, it is indelible. There is nothing I can do. If there are mistakes in the work, if there are mechanisms that don't work out to my satisfaction, too bad. I think it's incredible. Every artist should feel the privilege of feeling that they are as much a viewer of the work as anyone else.
And letting go. Given your attention to detail and your clear desire to formulate or to categorise, or at least to parcel things up, that's quite an admission. I just want to finish with just go back to the Tomb series, because it's very clear from a conversation with you that, you know, the false distinctions between, or people's obsessions between the digital and the physical, and which is the best. You know, it's clearly we live in a hybrid world, and this project you dovetail between the two kind of very deftly, where you start with an idea, then it's sort of almost now defunct or nostalgic system of storage, you know, the disc. Then it becomes something that through chain becomes redigitalized or put into a different sphere. But then you go through the process of of computer drawing each of them as if by human hand, but through digital.
It is on the trackpad, so it's quite manual.
Yeah, manual and removed, but probably more manual than some processes. Actually.
Yeah.
And then we're now having it in book form, which is in some ways, I mean, the book's not that old, post-manuscript, but, you know, nonetheless, the demise of the book's been predicted for a long time, and it clearly is much more resilient than anyone ever thought. But I love this dovetailing of different media, but the physicality of book design clearly interests you. Do you plead guilty to some kind of nostalgia, or are you trying to reinvent what the book can be?
I think it's fair, hopefully, that, if I had my day in court and the accusation of me being a nostalgic fetishist was thrown at me, that maybe we can point to a few things in the book which I think are at least show an interest in what the future of the book might be, not just its past. It's something that I'm really grateful to have had the opportunity and proud of the results. I'm excited for people to see them in this book. Is we developed a custom color space for printing the book. It was very important to me that the work in a physical form didn't feel like just an apology or a kind of like less than manifestation of a work that people may be familiar with in a digital perspective. It's not an attempt either to accurately reproduce the digital object, because that doesn't make any sense. One of them is an additive print process where you have light beamed through a screen and it's literally luminous, and the other is a subtractive one where light is absorbed by paper, and that's how you see color. So there will be two different experiences of a similar idea. But we wanted one of the beauties of the screen, and you could say the book is inspired by the screen in this regard, is that color is so luminous and vivid. And I have a tradition of drawing work, and it is a device that I'm very interested in, by isolating objects on this black void, which, as a small aside, is another thing which I think was me attempting to try and make sense of our time by drawing on strategies from the past. I think about the modernists, I think about Tischold, I think about the first generation in the Bauhaus, whose conceptual advance, their invention of things like sans serif typography, or the utilization of asymmetric grid layouts, was done in part because they returned to the fundamentals of their medium. They were able to say, what is it that we are doing here when we put information on a page? And they broke it down on a quite fundamental level to the idea that type and design form is information preserved on a substrate. That substrate is printed paper, and that both of those things combine to form the experience of the viewer. So both of them are as important as the other. And therefore the idea of the whiteness of the page becoming valuable information, and that no need to make ornament to elevate the type above it, but to instead create systems that create synthesis. You use the negative space of a column on the left and blank on the right in order to draw both attention, gravity, balance and poise to that layout. That it wasn't just that there's a privileged layer that sits on top of a very humble architectural pediment, but that they are both part of the same experience. And I thought about our moment, and I thought about our time, and I thought about the fact that I am a designer who works in a medium where my work will be transmitted primarily by screen. How do I draw attention to the screen? How do I venerate and respect it as a fundamental component of every composition that I make? Well, I should learn from Tischold and I should incorporate the screen into my designs. What is the screen on a fundamental level? What is the whiteness of a page on a screen? It's the unlit pixel. It's the 00000 RGB pixel. It's the pixel without any light passing through it. It's the unprinted surface of the screen. And so the presence of the black void in my work is no different to the presence of the white paper in the publications of the Bauhaus. It is presenting the viewer with a synthesis of medium and content that forms the work. The tombs appear and have within the work itself a black void. They appear on a black void. They're printed on pages that replicate this void space in paginated form. And so this is like a double sin in some way, because I'm printing the entirety of the page. The information within that book is the only unprinted space, the text. It's the only presence of the page, the kind of last remaining endangered species of the substrate that those books that are printed on are the pages where there's even a page number. There are no fully black pages in that book. There is always at least a page number, even on the void space pages that create kind of intermissions. But with respect to Tischold, please forgive me. You know, this is my entry into the book medium as a screen space native of my generation. This is what I would consider an opus that translates the principles of our age to the book. It's a different approach to the one that the modernists would have used, even if aspects of it are certainly out of the lineage of the modernist design movement. It has a grid. It's in Helvetica Neue, in Max Meidinger's typeface. It's not even in a typeface I designed, which people who are familiar with my practice will know it's highly unusual. But it is, I hope, a homage and a synthesis to the potential of both media. It does not speak so much to their past as to where their present might lie and what their future might be.
You talked about your day in court. It's a complicating verdict. I think you've made a very good case for the defence. But given that you admitted to a double sin, I think you're guilty, but not as charged, but guilty on your own terms. But that's a pretty eloquent defence, David. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll take whatever punishment history has the.
History will be the judge.
History will be the judge, whatever it chooses to bestow. But thank you. Yeah, there's obviously so much to cover, but I think that gives hopefully a good grounds for a start.
It's a series of conversations. I think we've overrun time, but I to be honest, I think this is a gauntlet down to Avant Arte. I mean, we haven't gone into the realms of the Commission against free space. We haven't begun to touch on football. We haven't begun to look at historical repositories of knowledge and how that might impact on it. And I think there's a whole range of things we should talk about.
I'd love to. I really enjoyed it. There is a great deal, but thank you so much.
Pleasure.
It has been a pleasure. Cheers.